Welcome back to the fourth and final session of this DVD series where we are discussing the pre-tribulational wars, the road to Armageddon. And let's talk about that, Bill. Let's kind of give a summary, because when we talk about the road to Armageddon, we're talking about certainly the wars that precede and ultimately the final war of Armageddon, which we're not necessarily going to get into, but we are going to touch on it a little bit, right?
Well, we're on the road to Armageddon, but we're not actually going to do the Armageddon. That'll probably be reserved for a future DVD, we would hope. But one of the we've been summarizing throughout the DVD set, but basically we've talked about Iran and the nuclear disaster probably happening in Jeremiah 49, leading into a proxy war, the destruction of Damascus in Isaiah 17, probably then leading to the Psalm 83 war with all the peripheral prophecies, and in this last phase, we're going to talk about the connections, kind of bring it all home in Zechariah 12 and its connections to Psalm 83, because it talks about a war with all the roundabout nations. So it's very important concluding prophecy to connect with Psalm 83. But we kind of reserved the Egypt judgment for the last phase here, because there's two judgments actually going on with Egypt. One of them, I believe, is going to be resulting as a role in Psalm 83, but also in Daniel 11, the Antichrist goes into Egypt. And I believe he desolates that area there. So we want to get into both judgments on Egypt on the road to Armageddon.
Yeah, exactly.
So Egypt in the end times. You know, it's interesting when you just kind of throw the calendar back a little bit, 2010, when the peace plans were, President Obama was trying to make the Mideast peace, two-state solution, and he invited, Netanyahu and Hosni Mubarak to the White House, and you see these Abbas was there and the King of Jordan there, and Hosni Mubarak was active at that point in time. And then shortly after that, the next year, the Arab Spring happened, and Hosni Mubarak, as you know, he became imprisoned. He was overthrown during that Arab Spring period. And then you had another transition of a leader coming in, Mohammed Morsi. And so Mubarak was there between 1981 to 2011, but Morsi comes in, and he was only there from July 12th, 2012 to June 2012 to July 2013. And it was such a big deal, and he's with the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about the difference between Mubarak and Morsi.
Mubarak was basically a general who became kind of a dictator over Egypt for all those years.
Relatively secular.
Right, and the general populace of Egypt was not happy, obviously. That's why they overthrew him. The Muslim Brotherhood was very dominant at that period of time in Egypt, and their candidate, Morsi, was the one who came into the office at that point. Matter of fact, Time magazine called him the most important man in the Middle East at that point in time. But he didn't even last but just a year, showing the transitions and the volatility going on in Egypt. Then you got Abdel Fattah Sisi, who was also a dictator, an army general, who's going to be another dictator. So they never really should have got rid of Mubarak, because they got the same thing later. Yeah. But that's who's in charge right now. And when that happened, of course, the Time had to change its article to the most important moron in the Middle East. But I'm not sure that's a Time thing there. I found that on Google.
Right. Well, it is interesting when you look at the geopolitics of Egypt in that regard, because, when you think about even when Morsi got elected, and when you think about Obama's administration, they were kind of fomenting all of this Arab unrest, the Arab Spring in Libya, all at the same time. And so to see them go back, when he came into power, you saw these new religious, laws and prohibitions. So I think the general populace likes the idea of a relatively secular Egypt, which now, of course, that's what it is. And I think in terms of travel or even archaeology or tourism, it's certainly better under the secular. Not that we're advocating dictators, but in some regard, you don't have the religious extremism there overtly as much.
It's interesting because when Obama became president, he made a trip to Egypt, and he made it a purpose to have some of the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood sit in the front row. So Mubarak, when Morsi became the president, that was sort of okay. Obama was okay with that at that time. In Egypt, you really have sort of three factions there. You still have the Muslim Brotherhood, and you have a lot of just the civil people there who, want their own democracy, their own liberty, and that sort of thing. Then you have the government-ruled autocrats in that section there. The people who got hurt throughout the Arab Spring, who were really driving the Arab Spring, were those civil people, a lot of the youth and things that wanted their liberties and things,
Yep.
and not have a dictator over them. But as we go into Egypt, the future of Egypt, Joel 3:19 tells us that Egypt shall be a desolation, and Edom a desolate wilderness, because of violence against the people of Judah, for they have shed innocent blood in their land. So here we go, we got another connection. We talked about Edom in the past segment, their violence against Israel, but Egypt also, because of their violence against Judah, which would be part of Israel. And they're going to be a desolation. Now, Edom will be a desolate wilderness throughout the Messianic kingdom. Egypt will be a desolation for a little period of time going into the Messianic kingdom, and then it will be restored. Very fascinating. So we're going to talk about the two judgments of how we get there. But that's a second judgment when Egypt becomes a desolation. I want to take a moment here to say, when the Arab Spring was going on, this was a Drudge Report headline, Death and Division in Egypt. They said, okay, shoot to kill the protesters. I mean, that's how bad it was getting there. You remember those things. And then this burden against Egypt. And you're going to read in Isaiah 19, verses 1 through 3 in just a minute, but it says, I will stir up Egyptian against Egyptian, brother will fight against brother, or say Muslim Brotherhood at that case there, neighbor against neighbor, city against city, and kingdom against kingdom. Now, that kingdom, so I want you to read these verses, and I want to kind of talk about how that breaks down from brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor, city against city, kingdom against kingdom. It's a progression there of downward spiral. So go ahead and read Isaiah 19, verses 1 through 3. It
says here, the burden against Egypt. Behold, the Lord rides on a swift cloud and will come into Egypt. The idols of Egypt will totter at his presence, and the heart of Egypt will melt in its midst. I will set Egyptians against Egyptians. Everyone will fight against his brother, and every one against his neighbor. City against city, kingdom against kingdom. The spirit of Egypt will fail in its midst. I will destroy their counsel, and they will consult the idols and the charmers, the mediums and the sorcerers.
So what we have here in Isaiah 19 is part of I believe is the first judgment of Edom. And the Lord is going to fly in on a swift cloud, meaning this is going to, when this prophecy happens, it's going to happen quite swiftly. And we'll see a downward progression of events that happen to take place. And the idols will totter, and they'll consult their mediums and charmers, but they won't have the answers and that sort of thing. But what happens, and I think we saw a precursor of this in the Arab Spring in that past slide, Egyptians are going to come against Egyptians. This disturbance is going to be created there. Like we talked about, there's different factions inside of Egypt right now. And then they're all going to fight. The brothers are going to fight against brothers. So it's going to start door to door, family to family. Everyone's going to be against his neighbor. It's going to burgeon out into the neighborhoods, into the neighboring cities. Cities will start fighting against cities. We saw much of this going on, and then it's going to burgeon into a kingdom against kingdom. Kingdom against kingdom would represent go into a regional conflict. Yeah. Now remember, Jesus Christ quoted in the beginning of sorrows in Matthew 24, verses 7 and 8, nation will come against nation, and kingdom will come against kingdom. And I believe he was probably drawing our attention back to this particular scenario,
alluding
regional
to
conflict.
it for sure, yeah.
So that's sort of the scenario that's going to happen with respects to verses 1 through 3. I'm not going to have you read all of verses 4 through 14. I'm going to summarize these on a slide. Sure. What happens after that terrible situation starts to go on in Egypt? Civil strife leads to neighbor cities against city, kingdom against kingdom, regional conflict. Remember, this is all happening quickly. The Lord flies in on a swift cloud. We don't know why the Lord's got a judgment going here yet. We're going to find that out in a little bit. But these are more symptoms of what happens. Egypt will be given over to a cruel dictator in verse 4, Isaiah 19. We're still in Isaiah 19. The river dries up and tributaries turn foul. The whole fishing industry collapses. The entire textile industry falters. All who makes wages will be troubled of soul. Political and religious leaders will become foolish. The Lord causes Egypt to stagger like a drunkard, and unemployment plagues the nation. It takes us all the way through to verse 15. Now, we don't know why that's all happening, but this is a terrible situation for Egypt. Egypt is primarily the number one Arab, number one country in the Middle East over the Arabs there.
Certainly largest, yeah.
The saying says, as goes Egypt, so goes the whole Middle East. But something Egypt has done is upset the Lord. He's going to fly in and have a judgment here. We're not told why just yet. All this bad stuff happens to Egypt. So we're going to look at that in a second. And I want you to read Isaiah 19, verses 15 through 17. It
says, neither will there be any work for Egypt, which the head or tail, palm branch or bulrush may do. In that day Egypt will be like women, and will be afraid and fear because of the waving of the hand of the Lord of hosts, which he waves over it. And the land of Judah will be a terror to Egypt. Everyone who makes mention of it will be afraid in himself because of the counsel of the Lord of hosts, which he has determined against it.
Right, so he's talking about everyone in Egypt, wage earners, everyone is going to falter, the economy is going to collapse, and then he tells us what's going on. And what he's saying there is that Egypt becomes terrorized by Judah. Oh, Israel's involved here now. Something's going on with Israel, between Israel and Egypt. Remember, kingdom against kingdom, regional conflict. Egypt under the banner of the Hagarenes are more than likely in Psalm 83. Now when did Egypt ever experience this terror of Israel? Fruchtenbaum, Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, in his Footsteps of the Messiah books, writes this quote, "Never in ancient history has this been true. Only since 1948, and especially since the Six-Day War, have the Egyptian forces evidenced the fear portrayed in this passage. There's been fear and dread of Israel ever since. With Egypt having lost 4 wars with Israel and having heavy casualties, the fear is deeply rooted. Prophetically, today is still the period of Isaiah 19:16 and 17. So the first judgment is dealing with a problem between Israel and Egypt. And those wars Fruchtenbaum's talking about, 48, 67, the Suez War, 1973, Egypt was involved in those. Egypt has developed a fear, a terrorization of that. And they're going to, but the judgment ultimately leads to a point where there's actually, we haven't seen this happen in Egypt to the level that it's talking about in Isaiah 19. We saw it happen at the Arab Spring a little
Just
bit.
a taste. Yeah.
The whole country's going to collapse because of something that's going on with Judah. And then go ahead and read Isaiah 19, verse 18, which I think gives us the main clue.
It says, "In that day 5 cities in the land of Egypt will speak the language of Canaan and swear by the Lord of hosts. One will be called the city of destruction."
So as we conclude the terrorization that's going on, there's a problem in Egypt between Judah. What happens is it looks like there's going to be a conflict. And that probably could be part of Psalm 83, where I'm attributing this to. And in that day, 5 cities are going to be taken over by the Jewish people, and the language of Canaan is going to be spoken there, which is Hebrew. That's what appears to be suggested there. Remember, parts of Egypt, between Israel today and the river of Egypt, could contain these 5 cities, as you see on a map that we've got there. One of the cities is going to be called the City of Destruction. Why would it be called the City of Destruction? Something has happened right there, a conflict.
A memory. There's a memory.
Yeah, there's a conflict. So that's judgment number 1. But you know what's interesting is we talked about judgment number 2. Egypt's future even gets worse from that point forward, if you can imagine, because the Antichrist actually is going to go in the mid part of the tribulation. And I know we've been talking about the pre-tribulation wars on the road to Armageddon, but I think we'd be remiss if we don't talk about this other important prophecy in Egypt. So let's draw the viewer's attention. Let's have you read Ezekiel 29, verses 10 and 11.
All right, Ezekiel 29, verse 10 and 11. It says, "Indeed, therefore, I am against you and against your rivers, and I will make the land of Egypt utterly waste and desolate, from Migdol to Syene, as far as the border of Ethiopia. Neither foot of man shall pass through it, nor foot of beast through it, and it shall be uninhabited 40 years.
So what's interesting there is, and we're going to put those places, Syene, on the map. Egypt's going to be desolated for 40 years, a desolate wilderness. No Egyptians are going to live there. We'll see that they'll be dispersed. So, and this does not appear to be the result of the judgment with respects to what Isaiah 19 was talking about, because Egypt survives until because the Antichrist comes in there in Daniel 11 into the glorious land, and then he goes down into Egypt and conquers Egypt. It says in Daniel 11. So let's see where this is now. Syene is where the Aswan Dam is, relatively speaking, right there. So could it be, and we're just speculating here, that something happens, there's a conflict at the Aswan Dam there, and all of a sudden it turns into a big flooding area of some sort, and just wipes out, just floods out a lot of that area there, and it starts to create the desolation. I don't know.
Yeah.
But because of the location we're given in the detail of the prophecy, right by the Aswan Dam there, down to the border of Ethiopia, etc., maybe this could be what happens.
Yeah, Gary has written about this, and he's under that persuasion.
Right, that sort of led me to thinking in this direction, some of his writings and works on that. But then go ahead and read Ezekiel 29, verse 12.
Verse 12 says, I will make the land of Egypt desolate in the midst of the countries that are desolate, and among the cities that are laid waste. Her cities shall be desolate 40 years, and I will scatter the Egyptians among the nations and disperse them throughout the countries.
So see, Egypt's going to go into not only 40 years of desolation, but the Egyptians are going to go into 40 years of dispersion. They'll go into a diaspora. Now this, in my estimation, happens in the second half of the tribulation when there's not much time left on the timeline until the second coming and until the millennial kingdom kicks in, which means we're going to have an overlap of, probably 36, 37, 38 years of Egyptians wandering around in the Messianic kingdom. We're going to show that they have a remnant in just a minute. So some of these Egyptians will come to know Jesus Christ and survive the tribulation, like we talked about in Jordan, and Iran will have a remnant. We talked about that. But so, very interesting to me that 40 years is how many years the Jews wandered in the wilderness when they came out of Egypt. Yeah. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. Okay, so now read verse 13 and 14.
It says, Yet, thus says the Lord God, at the end of 40 years, I will gather the Egyptians from peoples among whom they were scattered. I will bring back the captives of Egypt and cause them to return to the land of Pathros, to the land of their origin, and there they shall be a lowly kingdom. It shall be the lowest of kingdoms. It shall never again exalt itself above the nations, for I will diminish them so that they will not rule over the nations anymore. No longer shall it be the confidence of the house of Israel, but will remind them of their iniquity when they turn to follow them. Then they shall know that I am the Lord God.
So, I mean, as we talked about right now, Egypt is not the lowliest of the kingdoms in the Middle East. As goes Egypt, so goes the Middle East. So their fate, their future, they're going to be a remnant that will come back. We'll show that in just a minute in the next slide. But then when they come back, they're going to be the lowliest of all kingdoms in the Messianic kingdom. So what an incredible turn of events for Egypt, and I mean, we're talking about these Arab countries that need to know these kind of prophecies because their futures are at stake here. At least the people living in them need to know about this stuff. So Isaiah 19 verses 24 through 25, I'll go ahead and read it while you're getting ready for the next section. We talked about remnants of Jewish remnant, Iranian remnant, Jordanian remnant will come into the Messianic kingdom. They'll come to know the Lord. They'll actually be restored. The captives will be returning, and the fortunes will be restored in the millennium kingdom to believers of those ethnic groups in the millennium. This will be the case also for Assyria. Remember, Assyria was part of Psalm 83. Egypt, part of Psalm 83. So it says Egypt, Assyria, and Israel in the millennium. Isaiah 19 verses 24 through 25. In that day Israel will be one of three with Egypt, and Assyria a blessing in the midst of the land, whom the Lord of hosts shall bless, saying, Blessed is Egypt my people, and Assyria the work of my hands, and Israel my inheritance. So even though Egypt will be the lowliest of the kingdoms, it'll still be considered with high regard, blessed is Egypt my people. Yeah. So, those believing Egyptians who go through the tribulation, that come back after the dispersion for 40 years.
This is a great passage of Scripture to stump your pastor with, in the sense of asking, who else in the Bible is called God's people?
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so listen, we're going to now shift and sort of summarize this. I think Zechariah 12 is where we would turn our attention to really summarize this Psalm 83 connections. We've talked about a lot of prophecies and judgments where the Israeli Defense Forces have been used by God as a tool of judgment. Remember, we talked about God in order for Israel to dwell securely, for Ezekiel 38 to happen, which says that Israel will be dwelling securely, a peaceful people living in a land with unwalled villages without walls, bars, nor gates. The judgments have to be executed upon those around them who despise them. That was in Ezekiel 28, verses 24 through 28. We read in Jeremiah 12 that God had a compassionate Mideast peace plan, but the calling was that the Arab states would need to worship God, or else those countries would be utterly plucked up and destroyed. Reflecting back on what we've already been teaching on these DVDs. Okay, what's interesting when we get to Zechariah 12, we're told in verse 2 that it's going to be a cup of, Jerusalem is going to be a cup of trembling for the Arabs and a burdensome stone to the nations in Zechariah 12 verses 2 and 3. We want to talk about what's that all about? What nations are we talking about? The Arabs, of course, the surrounding nations. Let's start by reading Zechariah 12 verses 1 through 3.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those passages of Scripture that if you have friends or family or even others that are skeptical about prophecy, this is a great passage because it's like reading out of the modern newspaper. Zechariah chapter 12 verse 1 says, "The burden of the word of the Lord against Israel. Thus says the Lord, who stretches out the heavens, lays the foundation of the earth, and forms the spirit of man within him. Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of drunkenness to all surrounding peoples, when they lay siege against Judah and Jerusalem. And it shall happen in that day that I will make Jerusalem a very heavy stone for all peoples. All who would heave it away will surely be cut in pieces, though all nations of the earth are gathered against it."
Oh, there's a whole lot being said right there, so we're going to take it one step at a time. Let's put a face on this here. Judah and Jerusalem, okay? Well, Jerusalem, you see on the map, it's in the middle there where the star is. What we're talking about right now, Judah is the southern part of Israel on the map. Samaria, of course, was the northern part. Right now, that's called the West Bank, geopolitically speaking.
Yep.
But it's ancient Judea and Samaria. So we're talking about Jerusalem, where the star is, and we're talking about Judea in particular is what we're talking about here. Now, I want to say, why is Zechariah going on verse 12? He's drawing our attention to something very important before he gets into talking about the cup of drunkenness and the burdensome stone. He's drawing our attention to something in Isaiah, but he says, "Thus says the Lord, who stretches out the heavens, lays the foundations of the earth, and forms the spirit of man within him." Well, we know in Genesis 1, the Lord created the heavens and the earth, and then created man, Adam, that sort of thing. But he's not drawing us to Genesis 1, he's drawing us to Isaiah 44, verses 24. And what we find there, it says, "Thus says the Lord, your Redeemer, and he who formed you from the womb," remember, forms the spirit of man within him in Zechariah 12:1. "I am the Lord who makes all things, who stretches out the heavens all alone, who laid the foundation and spreads abroad the earth and by myself." I've put in some paraphrasing in there, but in other words, he's basically paraphrasing what Isaiah said around 701 BC. Why is he drawing our attention to that? He's going to establish prophetic proof that Jerusalem and Judah belong to the Jews. The nations had no right to meddle in it. The Arabs had no right to try to take over Jerusalem. And I'll show you how he's doing this so completely. So he says in Isaiah 44:26, a couple verses down, he says, this is Isaiah speaking, "Who says to Jerusalem, you shall be inhabited by Jews, to the cities of Judah you shall be built by Jews, and I will raise up her waste places." Now what's interesting, when Isaiah wrote this around 701 or 710 BC, Jews already inhabited Jerusalem and the temple and Jerusalem and that sort of thing. They didn't have he was anticipating a future time where they would need to go back and reestablish themselves and inhabit Judah and Jerusalem and that sort of thing. So he was anticipating the Babylonian conquest, because at that point in time, the Jews were deported into Babylon for 70 years of captivity. They needed to go back at some point in time. So he's saying that. Now he goes on to say, in the same context, in Isaiah 44:26, you'll be restored. 44 verse 28 says, "Who says of Cyrus," now he's talking about King Cyrus, "He is my shepherd, and he shall perform all my pleasure, saying to Jerusalem, you shall be built by Jews, and to the temple your foundation shall be laid," of course by Jews. So now he's saying they're going to go back. It's still Isaiah speaking. They're going to be restored. Cyrus is going to do this. He's going to say, and Cyrus wasn't even born at the time. Cyrus was between 600 and 530 BC. So to summarize what we're saying here and how he establishes the proof, Isaiah wrote in 740 to 701 BC, and he said Jerusalem at that time was already inhabited with Jews, and the cities of Judah were already built. Why is he talking about this future prophecy? Nebuchadnezzar comes in 586 BC, destroys Jerusalem, and lays the cities of Judah waste. This is all history now.
Yeah.
King Cyrus in 539 BC conquers Babylonians and sends Jews back to Judah. So what Zechariah is now saying is, look, The generation Isaiah predicted who would rebuild Judah and inhabit Jerusalem, that's me. That's my generation, Zechariah's generation. We've been sent back and to Judah and Jerusalem, and this is our land. It's prophetically been proven. But the Lord who spreads the heavens and stretches the earth abroad, forms the spirit of man within him. We were dispersed, we were sent back, we own it, God gave it to us, it's prophetically proven. Now you have no right to come and contest our claims to this, is what's being said in verse 1.
Mm-hmm.
So then he goes on and says, behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling, dizziness, drunkenness, but to all the people round about when they shall lay siege, both against Judah and Jerusalem. Who are the people round about? He's talking about Sabib, the Hebrew word, in the neighborhood, in the circle of environment right around them. He's talking about the evil neighbors. He's talking about, I believe, the Psalm 83 people at that point in time. So then he goes on and says, and there's a couple translations I want to read. Now it shall happen in that day, this is verse 3, you read it earlier, that I will make Jerusalem a very heavy stone for all peoples. All who would heave it away, I'd say impose a burden, will surely be cut in pieces, and all nations of the earth are gathered and assembled against it. Though all the nations of the earth. I want to read another translation. And it shall come to pass in that day. Remember, in that day, when he's talking about in that day, he's talking about in that day that Jerusalem's a cup of trembling. Mm-hmm. When the Arabs are going to try to lay siege on Judah and Jerusalem. That I will make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all the peoples, all that burden themselves with it shall be sorely wounded, and all the nations of the earth shall be gathered together against it. Now, Mondo, some people have translated that as being the nations gathered against Israel, against Judah and Jerusalem, as Armageddon.
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard that translation?
Oh yeah,
before?
for sure. Yep.
Yeah. Matter of fact, here's a quote from John Wolford, who teaches this, and it's commonly taught that verse 3, Zechariah 12:3, is alluding to Armageddon, which I'm going to tell you why I don't agree with that necessarily, although I thoroughly respect Dr. John Wolford, of course.
Yeah, for
right?
sure, yep.
And he says in the Bible Knowledge Commentary of the Old Testament, that day, alluding to Zechariah 12:3, refers to the future battle, or better, the campaign of Armageddon, when the nation's armies will gather against Jerusalem. One problem with that right off the get-go is in Armageddon, the Antichrist has already gone in the midpoint of the tribulation in Jerusalem, and he's already done his damage there, and he violated the temple, abominated the temple. Now he's moving out into Armageddon, and he's got the armies coming to meet him there, and they're going to go try to kill the remnant that's hiding out in housing in southern Jordan, in Petra, right, where Jesus instructed them to go. So one is they're not really in Armageddon all necessarily gathering around Jerusalem at that point in time. But the major point, and this is why I would say it's in that day when we're talking about in the day that the Arabs are surrounding Judah and Jerusalem and trying to lay siege on it. Here's how I would translate verse 2 and 3. When Israel's surrounding Arab neighbors attempt to besiege and to falsely and forcibly possess Jerusalem in that day, the international community will attempt to intervene and impose a burden upon the city. Zechariah warns that this is a bad idea because the burden will boomerang back to sorely wound or cut to pieces those nations. And what do we see has been happening? The nations have been trying to intervene on the status of Jerusalem, especially American presidents. So we've had this happen. Even Donald Trump, when he was trying to make America great again, we were still messing with Jerusalem. You know, it's debatable, should we move our embassy there? Unfortunately, he said, yes, we'll move it there. But where this really gets, I believe they started to meddle, is when we get into UN resolution in 1947. But let's summarize for a minute and talk about what we've talked about, because I'm saying a lot of things really quick here. And I allow you to give me the time to sort of go through the teaching.
Absolutely.
But don't you think it's pretty clear that Zechariah has drawn our attention to Isaiah to establish the prophetic proof? There's nobody that can claim Judah and Jerusalem except the Jewish people.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, it goes all the way back, as we were mentioning in the last DVD, whether it's in Genesis 12, 15, and 17, the covenant promises.
Right. So he draws our attention back, saying, look, Cyrus sent us back. I'm that generation, so I'm fully qualified. Zechariah is fully qualified to say what I'm about to tell you. Don't forcibly and falsely try to stake claim on Judah and Jerusalem. It'll be drunkenness, trembling, dizziness, etc. So the nation's imposing a burden upon Jerusalem, Zechariah 12, verse 3. On November 29, 1947, UN Resolution 181, also called the Partition Plan, you see on a map up there, Jerusalem became an international zone determined by the United Nations. In other words, it's such a hot-button city that they had to make it an international zone. You see the map up there, the area they were going to go ahead and give in the resolution 181 was sort of the purple areas was going to be for the Palestinians, and the peach areas are going to be for Israel, right? But Jerusalem is international zone. So they're meddling and they're trying to divide Jerusalem. When Zechariah said, that's our land, that's our city, our holy city, right?
It goes on to this day. I mean, when you look at the history of the United Nations doing this, you think, well, why would they think they need to do this? But if you go back to World War I mean, that's where, once the Ottoman Empire was eliminated, you know, by France and Germany, basically, and Britain, I mean. And so here they were dividing it up, drawing a line out, getting a map, and that's why when you see Jordan and Iraq, there's all these straight lines, because they just got it out, and they were used to dividing and creating countries. So when 1947 comes along, they're going to divide it up again, and what was the result?
Well, you know, just prior to that, Syria was reinstated as an Arab state. Jordan was in 1946. They didn't make Amman, Jordan an international zone. They didn't make Damascus an international zone. This is a spiritual situation.
Yeah, no doubt.
So along comes Israel in 1948. The state of Israel is born. There's an Arab-Israeli war. We talked about it earlier. I believe it was a precursor to Psalm 83. I don't think it was a fulfillment of Psalm 83 at this point in time. And so then what happens? You get these tents of Edom, these Palestinian refugees. Okay, they were created as a result of that war. These Palestinian refugees are not only in the West Bank or in the Gaza where the Hamas are and that, but they're spread throughout the whole Middle East.
Yeah, all the other countries that they went out to at the War of Independence.
Right, and so this whole thing about a two-state solution is putting these people back into that area.
To their original places.
That they were going to be given by the UN resolution.
Yep.
But the Arabs said, no, we want it all. We want to wipe Israel off the map. The name of Israel will be remembered no more.
Yeah, I think you know, as you think about that, going back to historically, in that this offer was made to all the Arabs as well as Israel in 1947, and Israel said, "Great, we will take it." They weren't demanding Jerusalem at the time. The map that you had there, they were willing to accept it because they wanted any sort of legitimization by the world governing body. But it was the Arabs that said, nope, it's all ours or nothing. And that's kind of been the way it has been even since 1947.
Right, so in the UN resolution vote in 1947, it was all the Arabs who had gained their statehood that voted no against Israel. Yeah. And remember what Jeremiah's roadmap plan was in Jeremiah 12, we read it earlier, was I'll put you all back in your states. I'll pluck you out of Israel and bring you back into your homelands. So they got all their statehood, but they didn't want Israel to have their statehood. So it's a dichotomy that just didn't work out. So then you have the war. What happens in that war in 1948, they got the partition plan, and from 1947 to 1949, and there was an armistice agreement, which is it's sort of more of a demarcation. It's not a permanent boundaries or anything like that. And what you see is they had this green line. And it was the first time in the history of Jerusalem that the city was divided.
The famous green line.
The international zone, the international community is meddling and imposing a burden on Jerusalem. That's what Zechariah 12:3 warns, do not meddle, it's a burdensome stone to you if you do that. So they divided it West and East Jerusalem. And the old city was East Jerusalem, and Jordan was in control of that, the Palestinian area there. And the old city was there. But that didn't last very long at all. You had the 6-day war, so less than 20 years later, Israel wins a war against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, and they take over all of Jerusalem. So you see right there in the 6-day war, and all of a sudden Jerusalem, the red arrow there, that's all belonging now to the Jews. They took it all back. No longer a divided city.
Side,
It was never meant to be a divided city. The international community was meddling. And so at this point, Israel, but they made a colossal mistake. They gave control over the Temple Mount to Jordan, the Waqf, the Antiquity Society. And Jordan, of course, is holding that card close to their parliamentary heart, right? In other words, that's our area there. That's Islam's. Jerusalem is supposedly Islam's third holiest city.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that for a minute. So what's very interesting, we talked about the Palestinians are going to have no survivor. The Edomites will have no survivor, as per Obadiah 1:18 earlier. Mahmoud Abbas, their leader, says on when they were voted, they went to the United Nations to try to achieve non-member statehood status,
Yeah.
and they achieved it. So they're a member. They're not a recognized country or nation, but like the Vatican, they got non-member state status. And he celebrated on that day and says, one day a young Palestinian will raise the Palestinian flag over Jerusalem, the eternal capital of the state of Palestine. And then, of course, I would say, Mahmoud, did you read Zechariah 12, 1, 2,
Yeah,
and 3?
right.
This is their land. You got nothing to say about this. It's interesting. We talked about, they think Jerusalem is the third holiest city in Islam behind Mecca and Medina. And they think this because apparently Muhammad rode through the ethereal realm on a donkey or something to Jerusalem, and that maybe he ascended from there.
That's the story. It's not in the Quran, but that's the story.
That's their story. So listen, in the Bible,